So at Summit, we base our approach on a book written by David Noble. This book, I just worked with Dr. Noble. We completely updated it and rewrote it, and it'll be released in a new version sometime this year, I hope, maybe this fall. If not, it'll be next spring. But in the book, and this is going to be crazy. If you haven't been to Summit before, you're just rolling your eyes right now like, I can't believe I am even sitting here. But in the book, David Noble says there are 6 different worldviews that are predominantly influential in the world. So you see what he's already doing here. How many worldviews are there? There are hundreds of worldviews. In the Great Britain, I found out they classify all kinds of religions. There actually is a religion of Jedi that's an official religion in Great Britain. And I'm not joking. It has like 586 identified followers. So, yeah. And heavy metal is another religion in Great Britain. That's actually identified as a religion. So Ozzy Osbourne got something going there. So, you see, but you don't have to understand all those little ones. You don't have to understand the little regional religions. You don't have to necessarily even understand the religions that only people in one country believe. If you understand that, if you look at the whole world and 90% of the people in the world fall into one of these 6 right here, then you can make pretty good guesses about what's actually going to be true. You understand that that's the idea of probability, right? Let's say, for instance, what's going on sports-wise right now? The World Cup is over. Everything is done, right? This is the boring part of the summer. What's going on right now? Huh? What is? Oh, yeah, baseball. Sorry. I did not mean to offend the baseball players here. So baseball is going on right now. So let's say you are a fan of the Kansas City Royals. And the Kansas City Royals, you believe, are going to win the World Series. Somebody's got to win it. So the Kansas City Royals, you say, are going to win the World Series. And they are going to, in the playoffs, play against the Detroit Tigers. And the Kansas City Royals, you believe, are going to beat the Detroit Tigers. And you firmly believe this to the point where you're going to bet $1,000 that the Kansas City Royals will beat the Detroit Tigers in the American League playoffs. Okay? Let's say you go to Las Vegas to place your $1,000 bet, and you find out there is a 1% chance that the Kansas City Royals will even be in the playoffs, and a 0.5% chance that if they were in the playoffs, they would beat the Detroit Tigers. Would you still bet your $1,000? Not unless you're so rich you don't even care, right? You wouldn't bet it. I mean, if you did win, you'd win a lot of money in return. But it's just too risky. Let's say you find out, though, there's a 30% chance the Kansas City Royals could win. Would you then place your $1,000 bet? Some of you are saying, I can see it in your eyes. You're like, I might. Okay, you're the real risk takers in the group. Let's say you got to 51%. Now there's a better than not chance that the Kansas City Royals would win. Would you still place your $1,000 bet? Some of you are like, sure, yeah, because I got a better than 1 in 2 chance. It's only logical to place the bet, assuming I have the $1,000 that I want to spend in that way. Now, I'm not commenting on the ethics of betting. You understand? I'm just trying to give examples about probabilities. Let's say you got to the place where the odds makers were saying there is an 85% chance that the Kansas City Royals will win the American League playoffs. Would you then place your $1,000 bet? Yeah, most of you would say yes, because there's only a 15% chance you could be wrong, an 85% chance you would be right. You're pretty likely to be successful with your bet. So at some point when you get to 51% or better, the same thing is true in the world of ideas. You don't have to know with 100% certainty what somebody believes. If you can make just a reasonably good guess, then you can figure out what's going on in the times in which you live. Does that make sense? If you know that somebody you're voting for, every time a bill has come up to raise taxes, they voted yes, and now they're saying, well, I'm going to run for office and I'm not going to vote for any taxes. What's the smart thing to do? trust what they did, not what they say they're going to do, right? Because they're the kind of person who, when they get in that situation, people almost always will end up doing what they have done in the past, not what they promised they're going to do. So be very careful about that kind of thing. Well, you've got 6 different worldviews. Then you have 10 different categories. So we look at theology, philosophy, ethics, biology, psychology, sociology, law, politics, economics, and history. Why don't we look at engineering? There just aren't a lot of debates over the world of ideas in engineering. Do you know what I'm saying? The load-bearing capacity of a foundation that's at a certain level doesn't change based on how you feel about it. If you go to a bridge, how many of you are from Florida? You're driving across bridges every day, right? Almost every day. You're driving across bridges. You pull up to a brand new bridge. You say to the engineer, is this bridge safe? And the engineer says, I feel so good about how we collaborated together to make this bridge. I don't feel so good about the collaboration process. I don't want to hear that he feels good about it. I want to hear that he took into account the principles and rules of engineering. Could we have been wrong about those things? Yes, but see, in engineering, people don't debate about whether 2 + 2 = 4 or 4.1 or whatever. It's only really in the social sciences, theology, philosophy, things like that, where people come up with ideas that are so hard to grapple with that they can easily err, right? That's why it's so important to look at these 10 areas. All right, let me give you an example from my own graduate school. See if you can figure this one out. And again, we're only looking at probabilities here. We're not trying to find any certainties in it. We're just trying to triangulate. What's the good chance that something will be true or untrue? So let me give you an example. I went to the graduate school, the University of Denver, to get my doctoral degree. 25 people were admitted to my program. We were told ahead of time, only 7 of you will ever graduate, based on our historical averages. I wanted to know immediately, what do you do with the other 18? I mean, are they buried in the backyard? I know what happens. No, they just drop out. Only 7 ever graduate, that's right. I committed right away, I want to be one of the 7. Which means I have to do things right from the very first class. So I look at the class schedule, and it was a complete surprise. The very first class we were all scheduled to take from one of the star professors was called, listen to this, Psychology of the Spoken Language. Psychology of the Spoken Language. So look down the list of disciplines right here. Just guess. Which field are we likely in? That was my guess. Psychology. It's called Psychology of the Spoken Language. We're probably in the realm of psychology. Do you have to know for certain? Could it be a psychology class that's actually an economics class? Sure, it could be. But I'm not trying to lock down everything here. I'm just trying to make some good guesses. The fact that psychology is in the title of the class, pretty good guess. So I know I'm in the psychology field. Then I went to the bookstore to get the book. The textbook was by a man named L.S. Vygotsky. This one's a little harder. Take a wild guess as to which of those 6 worldviews he was likely coming from. Marxist worldview. Why do you say Marxist? Okay, it sounds Russian. What's the connection between Russian and Marxist? Yeah, Russia was for many years before your lifetime called the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was the country in which a man named V.I. Lenin and his successors tried to put into practice the principles of Karl Marx. We'll get into the Marxist worldview at another time. But Vygotsky sounds like a Russian name. Very good chance he came through a Marxist system. So again, we're just making a guess, but I think it's probably a pretty good guess. I say it's a good guess because I just went to the encyclopedia and found a very simple description of L.S. Vygotsky. The very first thing I learned about him was he was a student of Ivan Pavlov. Have you ever heard of Ivan Pavlov? Okay, Ivan Pavlov, what did he do? Yeah, he studied these dogs. He would ring the bell when he fed them, and then he found after a while he would ring the bell and they would anticipate the food. Their bodies would anticipate the food. They'd begin to generate saliva in anticipation of the food at the ringing of the bell. This was a very exciting result because it meant that he could create certain conditions in which he could control the dogs. The Marxist authorities went wild over his research because they believe human beings are just like dogs, except we are on 2 feet. We don't have souls or spirits or whatever. In fact, the idea that Pavlov put forward was called monism. It's a form of behaviorism. Ism is a belief. Mon means what? One. A belief in one what? Not one leader. One what? One. A person is made up of one substance. So whereas a Christian would say, yes, we have bodies, but we also have souls. That would not be monism. Monism would be we only have one substance. And what do you think it is to the Marxist? We're just bodies. Karl Marx said human beings are simply matter in motion. Marvin Minsky said, your brain is a computer made of meat. Your body, there's no such thing as a soul, no such thing as a spirit, no such thing as transcendent principles, no such thing as a mind. We are only bodies. That doesn't mean we can't think, and this is where Ellis Vygotsky came into the picture, but that was his idea. So the Marxist authorities loved Pavlov because he was giving them the psychology they needed, they believed they needed to control the whole world. All right, so I knew all of this going into my class, Psychology of the Spoken Language, 25 students, very first class we took. What am I supposed to do now? Do I go in and say, Professor, are you a closet communist? Admit it. This textbook author is a commie. We should not be reading this. There would be 24 students left in the graduate program, right? I would be the first one out. You got to play it smart. So what do? So all I did was ask questions. I just came in and said, Professor, before we get started with everything else, can you just give us a little of the history of our textbook author? What do you mean? Well, just tell us a little of the intellectual history of L.S. Vygotsky. What did he do? So we can become familiar with him. So he said, well, that's a good question, really interesting. Ellis Vygotsky was da-da-da-da, and he kind of explained it a little bit. Never mentioned Ivan Pavlov. So I said, well, I understand that Ellis Vygotsky was a student of Ivan Pavlov. Is that what you understand to be true? Yes, it is. In fact, good point. Really interesting that you know that. I said, well, he said, well, why do you ask? I said, because Ellis Vygotsky is considered by historians to have been a hack for the Communist Party, giving up his psychology to enable them to try to control the masses. And I'm just curious as to what you think Ellis Vygotsky took away from his mentor and what he left behind from his mentor. The rest of the class is sitting looking at me like, are we supposed to know this already? Honestly, it felt like cheating. It really did. Because I didn't know a whole lot. My professor started to treat me as if I was smart. And I never told him the truth. That I'm not. I just read a book. And the book gave me a little of the history of Marxist psychology, and then I went back and read a little of the history of Christian psychologies for a little bit of perspective and balance, and I understood more than all of my classmates about the world of ideas going in after reading 2 chapters that were 8 pages each. All right? So as we say in Tennessee, this ain't rocket surgery. You can do this. Does that make sense so far? Second thing, and then we're going to wrap it up. We'll be looking at that chart. You don't have to even know all the pieces. What page is that chart on there? 111. Page 111 is a larger copy of that chart. So we'll be looking at that in coming nights. Now I'm going to do my dead level best to make this as interesting as I know how. I have written on this now throughout the last year and a half. Teaching on it is a whole other matter. At one point, John Stonestreet was going to do these lectures, and I said, John, why don't we just flip all of our talks? You do all my talks, and I'll do all your talks. I have no idea why I said that. It seemed like a good idea at the time. So now I'm doing Worldview talks. So we'll start. I think, even Wednesday night. We'll start looking at maybe one of the key worldviews. Actually, we'll look at the Christian worldview. But there's another piece to this, and it's learning to develop the ability to ask questions. It's not just understanding how to triangulate ideas, but how to ask questions. 2 Timothy 2, 25 and 26. Get ready to quickly circle some things in this. And the Lord's servant must not quarrel. Circle not quarrel in your notes, not quarrel. Rather, he should, and then number this. Number 1, be kind to everyone. Then number the second one. Number 2, able to teach. Number 3, not resentful. So what's our attitude? We are not to quarrel. We should instead be kind to everyone, able to, not resentful. Those who oppose him, he must, and then just underline this, put a star next to it, whatever you need to do to remember it. He must what? Gently instruct. So what is a gentle approach? A gentle approach is to express curiosity. Let me just give you some very quick examples of this. Example number 1. One of my professors said to us in class, well, we all understand that the God of the Old Testament is a mean bully. He said it as if it is self-evidently true. And everybody in the class is like, oh, yeah. But I wondered, is it actually self-evidently true? Is there something more to it? So in that situation, I raised my hand and I asked this question, or some variant of it, and you could ask a similar question. Do you think that's the whole story? Do you think that's the whole story? I mean, are you so willing to dispense with 4,000 years of Judeo-American history with one sentence, that the God of the Old Testament is a mean bully? I mean, do you think that's the whole story? And obviously he said, well, of course not. But then he was in a dilemma, wasn't he? Because he had just made a statement and then backed off of it very quickly because he realized how politically incorrect it could come across. Some people don't really care that it's politically incorrect. But if he said, well, yes, I'm sure of it, then he would have been in an even more awkward position, because if he was sure of it, that means that he alone of all the people who have studied this question is the expert on what constitutes being a mean bully, that he's studied all of the situations, that he's assumed, for example, that Israel was an aggressor nation rather than a nation that was being oppressed by terrorists. You know what I'm saying? On and on. All kinds of things that he didn't take into consideration. So asking the question, do you think that's the whole story, opens the discussion wider rather than narrowing it, which is almost always a good idea. Second question you can ask, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? If somebody says there is no God, don't say, yes, there is, because they'll say, no, there isn't. And you'll say, yes, there is. And they'll say, no, there isn't. And you'll say, yes, there is, you moron. And they'll say, no, there isn't, you idiot. And all of a sudden you are in a quarrel. Yeah, some of you are from the South. You're like, a fight. That's right. That's what happens next. You throw those punches in Christian love. And, yeah. What do you mean? Just ask, what do you mean? If somebody says there is no God, don't say, yes, there is. Just ask them, well, what do you mean by God? One guy said, well, the big grandfather figure in the sky throws lightning bolts down on people he doesn't like? Zeus? No, what? No, I don't believe in Zeus either. So that's a little bit baffling. But, let's go a little bit deeper. You understand how asking for definitions of the terms takes the discussion deeper. So you've got a question that broadens it. You've got a question that takes it deeper. Third question, how did you arrive at that conclusion? This question takes it from the outside to the inside. So let's say, for instance, I married Joe Sharp. I probably gave you this a similar example. If you ask somebody, if somebody says to you, well, I can't believe in a God who is good because there's so much evil in the world. If you ask the question, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Very often a person will say, when I was a kid, I prayed for my aunt that she wouldn't die from cancer, and she died anyway. You see how it's not a way of thinking about the question that's logical, but it is a way of processing it. It's very personal to that individual. It comes back to a source of pain that's been externalized in this generalized statement that God can't exist. Do you see that? And you would approach that differently if you understand what the person's motivation is. You wouldn't approach it by saying, well, we need to go back to the philosopher Leibniz and study all the arguments for theodicy. No, you would say, gosh, that must have been really hard. I'm really sorry. Tell me about your aunt and your relationship and why you felt so disappointed. And you say, we don't want to talk about that. We want to get that person over it so they can accept the truth. No, that's not actually so. You might just want to say, tell me what happened. Talk to me about that. And then gradually you might want to be able to say something like, help me understand how that personal pain that you felt, you believe makes a valid generalization about the whole world. Well, I'm not saying there isn't a God, I'm just saying I can't believe in one. Well, what if it isn't about our belief? I mean, if there actually is a God, then whether we believe he exists or doesn't is really not relevant, is it? See, do you see how you can bring the discussion back around to the two ideas, but you don't want to be so crass and callous to not understand why a person would say the kind of thing they say in the first place. Fourth question you can ask, how do you know that what you believe is true? How do you know that what you believe is true? I'll give you a quick example of this. A buddy of mine, Rusty, takes groups of students to tour the Denver Museum of Natural History. When he goes into the museum with them, he always tells them, if anybody asks you anything, just ask them, how do you know that's true? Very simple question. So they walked in the museum. There was a person in the museum with a white lab coat on going to prove to them how we can show that humans evolved from pre-human ancestors using paleontology. The students didn't know anything about paleontology. They just knew one question to ask. Every time she made a claim, they just raised their hand. How do you know that's true? How do you know that's true? After they asked it 4 or 5 times, this person threw up her hands and said, look, children, I don't know, okay? I just work here. In a way, I felt bad for her because there's nothing more dangerous than a group of children with a question, right? I mean, how many of you have little brothers and sisters? Giving them a question is the intellectual equivalent of giving them a surface-to-air missile, right? They will shoot it. You'll put it above the fireplace. They sit on the back porch waiting for something to fly over. I mean, that's just the way children are. And you can understand, at first I thought, oh, I feel sorry for her because there are all these children asking this obnoxious question. But then I realized she didn't have to frame it the way she did. She could have said, there are certain people in the world, they believe in evolution. And in order for evolution to actually be true, or to explain the whole of the world and why we have the diversity of life we have, human beings have to have somehow evolved as well. What did they evolve from? Evolutionists believe this, and I'm going to show you why they believe what they believe, and you can understand and try to evaluate the question. That would have been a very fair way of stating it, but that's not what she did. What she did instead was try to overpower them. You know, I am the scientist. Even wearing the white lab coat was a strong symbol that I know what I'm doing, I'm in charge here. Do you see the point? So the goal of asking the question is not to try to make the person feel like a fool, but to try to deconstruct all of those symbols that they use to build up their power in a false way to try to promote ideas that are actually wrong. How do you know what you believe is true? Fifth question, what happens if you're wrong? I found, and I'll close with these examples, I found in my life that at the university campus, I wanted to talk to people. That's what I wanted to have discussions. How many are already attending a university? It's like a couple weeks you're going to be off there. Where do you go to school? Yeah. Colorado Christian. UC Davis. Okay, where else? Yeah. UCCS. Okay, where else? Yeah. CSU. Columbia University. Okay, yeah. University of Illinois. Okay, so you got a wide variety here. Some of these are very big schools. How many students go to the University of Illinois now? 35,000 students. 35,000 students. You know what's weird? Last time I was at the University of Illinois, nobody talked to anybody else. It was kind of weird. Everybody walks out of the buildings, they're doing this, or they're listening to music on their headphones. It's not like you have a community of 35,000 people who are all excited to be part of the same university. It's like you have 35,000 people who are all in their own little worlds. If you walk up to somebody and start a conversation, they freak out. They're like, oh, you scared me, dude. Can't you see I'm texting right now? But if they set up an exhibit on campus and hand out literature, you could go talk to them all you want. So I went to the student union when everybody was having their exhibits. My favorite day of all the whole year, every year I was there, was Animal Rights Day. Everybody set up their tables, and they were all handing out literature. So I walk up to one guy. What are you doing? We're saving the baby harp seals. Why? Well, look at them, dude. He showed me a picture. You know, they're white, fuzzy, with big black eyes. I said, what happens to them? He said, look. And he showed me some pictures of some men clubbing them. And all of a sudden, they're covered with blood. These little, poor, little, helpless harp seal pups are covered in blood. They take the skin off, and they turn it into coats. I was like, haven't they ever heard of Gore-Tex? Come on. Why do you need to take the skins off of the harp seals and make them into coats? It seems just like bad stewardship to me. So anyway, I was just thinking that. And then I asked him a couple questions. Do you save the grown-up harp seals as well? He didn't know. I later found out why. I saw a picture of a grown-up harp seal. They don't stay cute. Grown-up harp seals look like Jabba the Hutt. It's just so much easier to save cute things than ugly things. So I started to learn my lesson about, with the persuasive techniques, right? And if you only have a few minutes with somebody and you show them a picture of something cute, you're going to get their heart. You can't really get their mind just walking around from table to table, but you can get their heart right away. So I said, well, that's really terrible that they clubbed those harp seals, but why do you care about this? I mean, you don't have any real investment in it. You don't live in the Arctic or whatever. I mean, why? What is the big deal for you? If he would have said, look, don't you think this is bad stewardship to kill the baby harp seals? Let the polar bears get them, all right? I mean, somebody's going to come after them. In this case, it was Eskimos coming after them. But if he would have said, I think it's bad stewardship, I think we should just let nature take its course, I don't think we should be killing them and making coats out of them, I probably would have said, I agree with you. Makes sense to me. I have no dog in this fight, right? But that's not what he said. What he said to me was, who were we to say that we are any better than any other creature? And he said it with such an attitude that I was thinking, that is an opening big enough to drive a truck through. And I like to drive. So I said, well, what do you do with the creatures that are not politically correct? Like what? Well, I said, for example, like dust mites. I didn't have a picture with me at that time, but here's a picture of a dust mite. Dust mites can live in carpet, they can live in your bed, they live in your garage, they live in your house. You have millions of them, according to reports about this. They're so tiny, they float around in the dust. I should mention they're tiny. This picture is expanded, just so you know. Otherwise, you would know if you had a dust mite on you, and your roommate would know. But they start to itch for obvious reasons. They colonize on you. And so they itch. So what do? Well, you take a shower, and you put shampoo on your hair, but I asked this guy, I said, do you bathe? He said, yes. I said, do you use shampoo? Yes. Have you any idea what shampoo does to the bodies of dust mites? He said, no. I said, well, they swallow it in their mouth. And it goes inside and it poisons them and they rupture and they die and they wash down the drain dead. He said, why are you telling me this? I said, because if it's really true, who are we to say that we are any better than any other creature? How do you justify being a mass murderer of dust mites? And he thought that was funny, which I was glad because I didn't want to offend him, but I did want to have a vibrant discussion. So we ended up talking about where we would decide, how we would decide. You end up in a discussion of worldviews every time when that happens. Make sense? So, let me give you this in closing. John Woolman used the power of questions. You've heard a lot probably about William Wilberforce, how he was able to get a bill passed in Britain abolishing the slave trade, ultimately abolishing slavery in the British Empire. But John Woolman is a lesser-known story. He was a Quaker farmer in the United States of America who came to the conviction by thinking biblically about persons that owning slaves was wrong, so he freed his slaves. Then he went around to his neighbors to ask them to free their slaves as well. But he didn't ask them to free the slaves by pressuring them or trying to manipulate them or making them feel guilty. Instead, he just asked questions. What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to put a person in your will and hand that person down in the same way you would hand down a piece of furniture to somebody in the next generation? And by the end of John Woolman's life, if you're an English major, you might actually read the journals of John Woolman. By the end of John Woolman's life, there was not a single Quaker in the United States of America who owned a single slave. It was the power of questions to bring about right action. So if we can understand and triangulate some things about the world of ideas, which is what we're going to work on in the next few nights, and we know the right questions to ask and express them with curiosity rather than with cynicism or belligerence, then we can, over time, learn to not only have more fun in conversations with people, but also we don't have to feel intimidated. We can learn to dive right in and gently instruct in the hope that God will grant them repentance.